All right, let's jump right in. We've had a ton of you send in research about introversion and happiness, and we're taking a deep dive into it today. Get ready to rethink some common beliefs. Turns out, the link between your personality and how happy you are is, well, way more complicated than just extroverts are happier.
Yeah, exactly. You know, for a long time, that whole extrovert ideal was kind of the dominant idea. Books like Quiet really brought that discussion to
Oh,
everyone.
we're sure.
And at first, some studies did seem to back that up. Like extroverts seemed to report they were happier, but more recent research, yeah, it's showing us a more complex picture for sure.
Okay, so what's changed? I mean, have we been wrong about extroversion this whole time?
Not necessarily wrong, but definitely oversimplifying things, I think. One problem was earlier research kind of lumped different personality traits together, you know? And it turns out introversion isn't just about like being shy or quiet.
So how do scientists actually define introversion then?
Okay, think of it this way. Picture a party. Loud music, lots of people, flashing lights. An extrovert might totally thrive in that, right? Their brain's lighting up with all that stimulation. An introvert, though, might find that same scene way overwhelming.
Got it. So it's about how sensitive you are to that external stimulation, all that stuff going on around you.
Exactly. Introverts tend to be less sensitive to those external rewards. Things like social recognition, excitement, new things. Like psychologist Colin DeYoung said, it's all about your, quote, responsiveness to reward cues, end quote.
Okay.
And, you know, that lower sensitivity, it shows up as more reserved behavior, but it doesn't automatically equal shyness or even creativity. Those are different things altogether.
This is where it starts to get really interesting to me,
Yeah.
because if happiness isn't just about being super outgoing, then how do we explain all those people who love their quiet time but are still, like, super content?
Yeah. Researchers are finding that there are lots of different pathways to well-being. It's not a one-size-fits-all, you know, where being extroverted is the only way to be happy. In fact, they've actually found 5 personality characteristics that are strongly linked to well-being, and it doesn't matter if someone's introverted or extroverted.
Okay, all right. Let's hear them. What are these, like, secret ingredients to a happy life?
Number 1, enthusiasm. That real excitement and passion for stuff you care about. Then there's low withdrawal, meaning you're not always retreating from social situations or new experiences. Doesn't mean you got to be the life of the party, but you are engaged with the world around you.
Makes sense. You've got to be
Yeah.
present to actually experience all those good moments.
Right. Then we got industriousness or grit, that persistence to go after your goals even when things get tough.
Oh, I like that one.
And then compassion,
Yeah.
you know, being kind and caring toward yourself and to others.
Mm-hmm.
And finally, intellectual curiosity, that drive to learn, explore new ideas, always learn.
You know, as you're listing these off, I'm realizing how many of them really resonate with me. I mean, I'm definitely more on the introverted side, but I also get super excited about learning new things, always up for a challenge. It's really cool to see how those traits can play into my own well-being.
Yeah, and that's the main takeaway here, right? Happiness isn't about forcing yourself into some kind of mold. It's about understanding what your strengths are and using those to create a life that feels real, fulfilling.
Speaking of authenticity, you mentioned earlier that research is kind of challenging this idea that we need to be more extroverted to be happy. Didn't one study even find that there's like a downside to faking it as an introvert?
Totally. Rowan Jock Hamilton and his team found that always trying to act like an extrovert can actually hurt an introvert's well-being.
Okay, so spill the tea. What kind of negative effects are we talking?
Well, first of all, the study found it can lead to weaker positive emotions. Like, introverts who are forcing themselves to be more outgoing might experience less joy or excitement, even when good stuff is happening.
That makes sense. If you're not being true to yourself, it's got to be hard to fully embrace those positive moments.
Right, and it's more than just, like, dampening those good feelings. The research also found that faking extroversion can actually increase negative emotions, like anxiety, tiredness. It's just draining to constantly put on a show that doesn't feel real, you know?
Yeah, and maybe even more important, constantly trying to be someone you're not can make you feel less authentic.
Yeah.
Over time, that can really mess with your sense of self, you know, and it makes it harder to connect with like what you actually need and value.
It's like you're living someone else's life. No wonder it takes such a toll.
Exactly. And this really shows us how important it is to have spaces where introverts can just be themselves, you know, without feeling that pressure to perform, to be extroverted. Now imagine how much harder that gets if your whole culture, like where you live, values being extroverted above everything else?
That's a good point. Does where you live actually affect your happiness if you're an introvert? It might. See, Ashley Fulmer's research looked at that, like this idea of cultural fit and well-being. And what they found suggests that that positive link between being extroverted and being happy, it was much stronger in cultures where being extroverted was like the norm.
So if you're an introvert living in a super outgoing, socially driven culture, you might actually be at a disadvantage when it comes to happiness.
It's possible. Researchers call it the person-culture match hypothesis, basically. The more you match your personality with your society's values, the happier you're likely to be. But of course, it's not always that simple. Plenty of introverts thrive in extroverted cultures. But it is important to be aware of those potential challenges.
This makes me think about all those environments where introverts might feel really out of place. Like, what about a field like medicine? You got to be pretty outgoing to deal with all those patient interactions and that fast-paced hospital environment, right?
That's a perfect example. And there's actually some really interesting research on that. There was this qualitative study that looked into the experiences of introverted medical students, and the findings, pretty eye-opening.
Oh, wow.
A lot of these students, they felt like misfits, like always wondering if they needed to change who they were to succeed.
It must be tough to feel like you have to suppress such a big part of yourself just to fit in.
Totally. The researchers even included some direct quotes from the students to, show their struggles. One student said, quote, "Just because we aren't constantly talking and letting everyone know everything going on in our heads, we're seen as the weird ones," end quote. Another talked about feeling this pressure to change their whole personality after reading a book about influencing people.
Wow.
Imagine feeling like you have to completely change who you are just to succeed in something you chose, right?
It's sad to hear those stories. I can only imagine how isolating that must feel.
It is, and it really highlights how important it is to recognize and value what introverts contribute, not expect them to just conform to this extroverted ideal. And interestingly, the researchers found that some of these students felt so much relief, validation, after watching Susan Cain's TED Talk about the power of introverts.
There's power in seeing yourself represented, realizing you're not alone.
Exactly. And based on what they found, the researchers actually suggested some changes to make med schools more accommodating to introverts. Things like pausing for longer after asking a question, to give introverts time to process and answer.
Yeah, those little adjustments can make such a big difference. It's all about making it more inclusive so everyone can do well. So with all of this in mind, what's the takeaway for introverts out there who might be feeling that pressure to change? How can they embrace being introverted and still find happiness, success?
Self-acceptance is the key. It's about realizing that introversion isn't a weakness. It's just a different way of being in the world, and it comes with its own strengths.
This reminds me of that study by Rodney Lawn and his colleagues. They found some pretty crazy stats about how society sees extroversion.
Oh yeah, totally. Their research found that a huge 96% of people thought extroverted characteristics were more valued in society. And get this, over 82% of the people felt they had to act extroverted every day.
Wow, that's a lot of pressure to fit in.
It is. But here's the encouraging part. The introverts who are comfortable with being introverted, the ones who saw it as positive, they actually showed more authenticity. And here's the kicker. Their well-being was pretty much the same as extroverts.
So basically, liking who you are, accepting being an introvert, it's like a superpower.
Exactly. It comes back to that idea that there are multiple ways to be happy. You don't have to change who you really are to live a happy, fulfilling life.
This is so empowering. It really flips the script on this idea that we got to be more outgoing to be happy and successful.
Yeah, I think that's a really important takeaway, It's all about shifting how we think, from limitations to possibilities.
And going back to those 5 pathways to well-being, remember those. Enthusiasm, low withdrawal, industriousness, compassion, intellectual curiosity. Those are things anyone can work on, no matter how introverted or extroverted they are.
Totally. It's not about trying to become someone else. It's about figuring out what strengths you already have and then finding ways to use them even more.
So for our listeners out there, the ones who maybe feel a little lost, like they don't quite fit in, what advice would you give them? How can they start to embrace being introverted and really use those strengths?
I think it starts with recognizing that your introversion, it's not a bad thing. It's a good thing. The world needs people who think things through, who listen carefully, who see problems differently. Think about those med students we talked about. They bring something unique to patient care because they're more reserved and observant, you know?
And I bet they're amazing listeners, which is huge in medicine.
Oh, absolutely. So instead of focusing on what you think are weaknesses, ask yourself, what are my strengths as an introvert? Maybe you're really perceptive, great at focusing, a creative problem solver. How can you use those things to do something meaningful, something that feels right for you?
It's about finding those places, those communities where those strengths are celebrated, not shut down.
Exactly. Happiness isn't about fitting in, it's about belonging to yourself, you know? Find your people, the ones who get you, and don't be afraid to let your introverted self shine.
I love that. So, to everyone listening, remember, you are not broken, you don't need to be fixed. Embrace those introverted strengths, find your people, and keep being awesomely you. Until next time.